House Homeland Security and Foreign Influence Committee will come to order. Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Chair Bruck.
Present.
Representatives Meerman, Shriver. Present. Menser.
Here.
Conlon.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
All righty, appreciate that. Minority Vice Chair Menser moves to approve the minutes of February 4th meeting. Hearing no objection, they are approved. All righty. Well, before we get on with our presentation today, it's been a long time since we've been here, it seems. Guess it's been just a few weeks, but it was a long time before that time, too. So it has been a little disrupted, but I did want to do a quick show and tell, seeing it has been so long. So today, I brought with me a mini T-wall. So people, I've had this on my desk in the house floor too, but this is built or made by the 77 company. It was actually in Baghdad, and I got this on my second tour. So if you can imagine this concrete structure, if you will, and I'll pass that to Eddie. They make them in all sizes, up to 22 feet tall. They'd be about 8 foot wide, and then about 3 foot. Yeah, the challenge coin from OIF3, technically, I think is what they considered that when I was there my second tour. But imagine those things very high, very wide, and up to 2.5, 3 foot thick, some of them, depending on their size, and then the base, and then they just interlock. So there's that little cutoff there, and they would, side by side, they interlock to make walls. For force protection around buildings, ECP, entry control points, walls around the entire bases, and depending on the threat level, if it was RPG or rockets, would depend on how tall they go and the thicknesses. Some were only like 4 or 5 foot tall too, so they had, every gamut. But I got that was a little memento from the guy that owned the 77 company, because I did a lot of contracting and such, and so he was handing those out one day. So I got one. I thought that was pretty cool. He did not give me the challenge coin. That was from my deployment, but there was a spot that they made in it, so they were kind of doing them as gifts and selling them and such.
Did anything get through that or nothing?
Depends on how many water bottles were stuffed in there before they poured the concrete, but somewhere there was a lot of inferiority processes, not with this company, not that I know of. They never had any problems, but yeah, it got to the point where a lot of people that were building and trying to bid on these would put styrofoam inside the T-walls, or water bottles or bags, like things to take wood to take up space, so it was less concrete and cheaper to make, but less effective. They could take a pretty good blast, but I've seen them blew apart, depending on the size of the ordnance. But they'd certainly stop small arms and RPGs and small rockets, depending on how it was hit and et cetera. But yeah, T-walls, Yukon barriers, Alaska barriers, they had different names for different size ones too. So if it was a super, super big one, it might be a Yukon or Alaska barrier, smaller T-wall, Texas T. They had all sorts of different nomenclature, but yeah, these were very, very effective, and we had thousands upon thousands of them. So.
And how big were they really?
Really, they would be up to 22 foot tall.
22 foot tall.
Yeah, wow. Probably the average was like probably that 12 to 14 foot range. Would probably be the average, because once you get in the big, it takes a lot more engineering capability to set them. But they would put that up, so I guess it's on the video too. But it all depended on the need. So if it's a 2-story structure, they would go with the taller ones. If it's just a connex, a living CHU, they would call them containered housing units, then it would probably just be the 8 or 10 foot tall T-walls that they would put around maybe 4 buildings in an area. They couldn't put them around. I mean, obviously they're very expensive too. They cost a lot, but for Force Pro, they would kind of make little sections to isolate in case there was a mortar that would come on a base, and it would only be isolated to a certain area, because the T-walls in between rows and such would stop, the shrapnel and other things. So I thought it might be interesting. So yeah, they were ginormous, like literally, as thick as this desk.
So they
and
put
as
them together
high as the
like
ceiling.
jigsaw puzzle pieces?
Yeah, they would just set so that slide. There's that jag,
Yeah.
so they overlap, so they could even do curves. Because there's an overlap there. Sometimes if there's too much of an overlap, they'd fill it with sandbags or something that would provide a little force protection in between the space too. Yeah. Around the planes, where the planes would park and such, the helicopter pads, they would put them as well, depending on what the threat and the needs were.
Okay, well, are you giving that to me?
I'll let you see it again, but you can't keep it. So then there's always, they even made it so there's that space underneath. They all came with that space, so you can. It's more for either, it's lifting. Sometimes there would be the tabs at the top, but really either at the bottom or so you can run things underneath a little easier. Commo wire, electric wire, whatever you need to run under without actually have to dig underneath. But we set a lot of them as engineers, a lot. But
That's kind of cool that you got the challenge coin embedded.
yeah, it takes it. It actually comes out too.
Oh, thank you.
But you can't keep that because that's a. But I didn't mean to belabor. We have some important discussion today. We have State Armor. We have Michael Lucci and Bob Pierce, here today. Going to be talking. They represent State Armor. State Armor. I guess I might say it wrong, but an independent think tank, and really specifically, you guys focus on CCP issues in a lot of areas. So we appreciate you being here. As a committee, as you do know, we worked on various aspects of drone and Homeland Security, and we recently, as of today, got the entire package passed out of committee. And that was really an outcropping of a lot of policy or discussion we had here in our committee that helped form our policy on the SHIELD package for Homeland Security. And now we're gonna transition slightly into and segue into foreign interference and influence here in Michigan. And so to start that off, we're going to let you guys introduce yourself and then get into your slideshow. And Jackie was supposed to be here, but she could not make a flight, so please give her our regards. But I'm sure you guys would be adequate. But we'll get Jackie here a different time too, I think. I foresee that. So without any further ado, introduce yourselves and take it off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Michael Lucci, founder of State Armor. We've worked with about 20 states on state-specific solutions, like the ones we'll talk about today. And today, Rob will start off nesting this in within a global view of what the Chinese Communist Party's strategy is vis-a-vis the United States. And then we'll break it down and talk about a few specific threats within Michigan. And then we'll walk through a series of policy solutions that have been enacted in other states and in many cases by the federal government, sometimes led by Michigan's lawmakers, including the United States Senator from Michigan at the federal level. So some of these issues are the federal government has already moved. The states ought to match what the federal government does. And then some of these issues are the states have very unique powers in our system. The states are the primary regulator of higher education, of utilities. Of course, states are the primary regulator of their own public procurements. And so in many of these issues, the states are responsible to deal with the problem themselves, accepting, of course, federal guidance on how to deal with it. So that's how we'll start. So I'll pass it over to Rob to talk about the global vision of the Chinese Communist Party strategy.
Great, thanks, Michael. And thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for having us to speak today. I very much appreciate the opportunity. By way of introduction, my name is Rob Pierce. Most of my background has been in uniform and in the intelligence community. I now work for former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien and his firm, American Global Strategies. And in that capacity, had the opportunity to support Michael as CEO of State Armor, testifying at various different state houses on the China threat. So I'm going to go through a number of slides to try to contextualize and frame how we think of the China threat, and then I'll get into a little bit more specificity on how that pertains to states like Michigan before turning it back over to Michael to get into some policy solutions. So the first two things I like to think about when we think about the China threat are, One, this is a system that is very dissimilar from ours. And oftentimes when folks in the US think of China, they succumb to mirror imaging. They try to look at the Chinese political system as potentially similar to ours, and their cultural norms are similar to ours. It's very important to think of their system as entirely different, their motivations as entirely different. And just two pictures here. One is the flag. So the biggest star on their flag represents the party. There's no viable political alternative in China. It is a one-party state led by an authoritarian leader, and it is the only game in town. The other 4 stars represent the various different social classes, but it speaks to the system that the biggest star on their flag is the party. Everything that they do is to perpetuate party rule and party authority. And then second, you might recognize the game Go. We think of chess and checkers. They're playing a whole different game than we are. They're playing a long game, thinking many moves ahead, whereas in the US, we're thinking through election cycles, 2 to 4 year windows. They are on what's been called the 100-year marathon. How do we supplant the United States as the world's leading power over decades? And they're pursuing a comprehensive grand strategy to achieve that goal. When China looks out at the world, there are 2 things in tension. One is they see a world that is descending into a more decentralized, chaotic global environment as they assess the United States to be turning insular, and they assess the United States leadership on the global stage to be declining. They'll often speak to the inevitability of U.S. decline and the inevitability of a China-led world order. They're trying in some ways to speak this into existence. And they see the world environment, chaos in the Middle East, conflict in Europe, migration crises. They see these compounding crises as opportunities, windows of opportunities for them to further ingrain themselves in the international community and make the world safe for their preferred system, an autocratic-led world order. But at the same time, they look out at their near abroad and they look at U.S. military actions globally, and they still see themselves as contained by the United States. That map on the right-hand side, shows if you're China and you're looking out into the Indo-Pacific, you see yourself as contained by U.S. bases on the Korean Peninsula and Japan and the Philippines. And of course, they're seeing what's happening in the world with Venezuela and Iran, and they still very much see the United States as not just a formidable competitor, but a competitor that they cannot yet overmatch in terms of military capacity. But they're trying to break out of this containment. A part of that breakout is through military modernization, but also a big part of that breakout, as I'm going to get into in further slides, is an attempt to weaken the United States domestically. They view the United States as, the best military in the world, the most capable adversary, the most capable country in the world, and they're trying to weaken us within. They view it as one of our strategic disadvantages that we have an open society that they can gain influence in. And also, as I go through these, please feel free to stop with any questions if you have any. A few baseline facts as we talk about China. One is their ambitions are global. They're pursuing a new world order led by Beijing. Sometimes you will hear folks say that China wants to be a regional power, that they do not aspire to global hegemony, global leadership. This is false. If you look at what they say and what they do, they are pursuing global leadership. They see the United States as the #1 adversary again, and they are taking concrete actions designed to supplant the United States as the world's leading power. They view the U.S. as the lead of the Western system and them as the lead of the anti-Western axis. People will often kind of downplay this network of alliances between between China, Russia, North Korea. And while it's true that China doesn't have alliances in the sense that the United States has alliances, where we have long-term, deep, trusting relationships, China and Russia, yes, there's a lot of distrust there, but you don't need trust at the scale that we might have with a country like Britain to be able to achieve strategic effect. So they are partnering with countries like Russia, North Korea, Iran. Certainly things are changing, but they're partnering with these countries militarily, economically, and again, it is to create this axis to counter US-led influence. There's a lot of Cold War parallels here, of course, two competing systems competing for spheres of influence. I do want to say China is not 10 feet tall. They have a number of inherent weaknesses. Depopulation, economic growth is slowing for the first time in decades. And of course, their system, which they view as a strategic advantage of hierarchical top-down, I view, and I imagine you all do too, that our system has, inherent advantages because we actually inspire our people and we give our people agency to be involved in our system. They do not. But they have deeply penetrated our country. Conflict over Taiwan is on the horizon. This is a legacy item for Xi Jinping. At some point we have to take him at his word. They want to take Taiwan. At some point we have to take him at his word that he will do it. And they believe that major power conflict between the US and China might be inevitable. But bottom line, China's rise is the greatest geopolitical crisis in our recent history. It's an extremely formidable adversary, and it's incumbent not just upon our federal government, but also leaders at the state level to take this threat seriously. So again, just doubling down here on China, the Chinese Communist Party seeing the United States as its primary rival. I won't go into too much of the history, but what a lot of China analysts have assessed is that really in the 1989 to 1991 timeframe is when they really developed this comprehensive grand strategy designed to challenge U.S. supremacy. There were what's called the three shocks, Tiananmen, where they assessed that the United States was on the side of the protesters that they massacred. The Soviet collapse, they found themselves isolated on the world stage. And then the first Gulf War, where they saw U.S. military supremacy taking out what at the time was the fourth biggest military in the world, Iraq, in a matter of weeks. And they saw very clearly in a condensed time frame how weak they were relative to the U.S. So they developed a number of plans and strategies to attempt to close that gap, and they've executed on that strategy very well. And I included that book on the far right, Rush Doshi. He worked in President Biden's National Security Council, really to highlight that this is an area of bipartisan consensus. I'm a proud Ohioan, but I live in DC now, and this is one of the few areas across the aisle where people are largely in agreement that the China threat is real and it requires decisive action. Here, just highlighting the scale of their economy relative to ours. Their economy continues to grow. There are arguments in the China, in the DC ecosystem on whether China is a rising power or a peaking power, and does that make them more or less dangerous depending on which side of the aisle or which side of that argument you land on. My argument is that even if their economic growth is slowing, they will continue to allocate the necessary resources towards military modernization and the things that make them a threat to the United States. So we should even if their economic growth slows down, we should continue to expect their military to modernize and them to continue to pose an increasing risk to U.S. forces regionally, globally, and continue to insert themselves into our domestic politics. This is just a quick slide, again, just kind of framing the threat. This is what both sides bring to the fight in the Indo-Pacific. Oftentimes you'll see comparisons between the US and China military that takes a holistic approach. So this is what the US military has in totality, and this is what the Chinese military has in totality. That's not the right question. The right question is, what do we have that we can bring to the fight in the Indo-Pacific, and what do they have in the Indo-Pacific? They far outpace what we have quantitatively and increasingly qualitatively in the region. Their military is purpose-built to be able to, number one, deter U.S. military intervention in the Indo-Pacific, and number two, defeat the U.S. military if the U.S. military decides to intervene in a conflict in their near abroad. They're planning for a home game. So when you think of a Taiwan contingency or potentially something over the South China Sea, That's what we're talking about here. So sometimes you will see people downplay the threat that the People's Liberation Army poses. It's really important to remember that their military is purpose-built for conflict with the U.S. regionally, and we are at a very significant disadvantage relative to what they can bring to the fight. And on the top right there, that's nuclear forces. They're rapidly modernizing their nuclear capability. And the reason why they're rapidly modernizing their nuclear capability is because they want to be able to fight a conventional fight without fear of U.S. nuclear escalation. They want to be able to take nuclear weapons off the table, reach parity on the nuclear side with the U.S. so they can dominate in their near abroad in a conventional fight. There are no shortage of sources of friction between the United States and the CCP. That top left image shows prisoners at an internment camp in Xinjiang province in western China, where they have set up camps to re-educate the Uyghur Muslim population. This is a horrific human rights atrocity that, in my opinion, does not get nearly enough attention. And it's just one example of the human rights abuses perpetrated by the Communist Party against their own people. And when we think about what a world would look like if China were to achieve their goal of surpassing the United States as the biggest player on the world stage, one should look no further than how they treat their own people. They would export that model globally. A couple of examples on the right, fentanyl, the Chinese government, China is the biggest supplier of the precursors of fentanyl, which is killing tens of thousands of Americans, as you all well know. Cyber espionage, intellectual property theft. The former FBI director said the intellectual property theft that China undertakes represents the greatest wealth transfer in human history, to the tune of billions of dollars every year that they're stealing, and it makes modernization for military or just tech or anything in general much easier when there's no associated R&D costs. They're stealing all of our intellectual property and then developing it cheaper in China and then undercutting US businesses. And then on the right, setting up alternative international organizations, again, as they assess the United States to be withdrawing from these international organizations. And then on the top right is the United Front Network, which is one of what they call their 3 secret weapons. It's an attempt to sway public opinion in their favor through currying favor with business, political thought leaders in the United States to perpetuate their own objectives. This slide I stole from a leader in my former community in the Navy, Admiral Studeman. This just shows Chinese S&T co-option of America. Again, a deliberate strategy to steal our technology so they can first catch up with the United States, which they largely have, and then surpass our technological capacity. And a good way to think about this is, again, China wants to achieve great power status. They view winning the Industrial Revolution as intrinsically tied to great power status. They look at the first Industrial Revolution that the British won, global superpower. The second Industrial Revolution with mass production, the US won, became a superpower. The third Industrial Revolution, electronics, the US won, solidified our role as the world superpower. They want to win the fourth Industrial Revolution, AI, machine learning, quantum computing, and become the global superpower. And a big part of that strategy is stealing our technology. So what does this mean for states like Michigan? As Michael alluded to in the opening, China's competition with the United States is a whole of government approach where they are trying to weaken the United States wherever they have the means to do so. So certainly at the federal level, our federal government is responsible for a lot of the competition with China. Of course, trade policy, foreign policy, the military. But as Michael said, it's really incumbent upon state leaders to take the lead on a lot of what China is doing at the state level, to include intrusions in things like critical infrastructure and in realms like education. Just a few more slides before turning it over here. So on critical infrastructure, just a couple things to highlight is, one, China has a national security and national intelligence law. What this means is that any Chinese company, so any company that is headquartered or owned by a Chinese conglomerate, is by law mandated to comply with any directive given to them by the Chinese intelligence services and by the Chinese Communist Party. That means that there is a Chinese company doing business in the United States that, through the nature of their business, acquires data, acquires information, or perhaps they just have placement and access that would be interesting to Chinese intelligence services. They are by law required to comply with any direction given to them by the party. There is no independent business the way that we conceive of businesses being independent from government. They view everything through military civil fusion. It is all part of a hierarchical system. It is all part of achieving that end goal of perpetuating party power. So the threats in critical infrastructure are ubiquitous. And a key thing here to think of intrusions in critical infrastructure, oftentimes you think of intrusions as being done for economic espionage, but increasingly what we're seeing is that these intrusions are being done for long-term dwell, what's called live off the land, meaning the only reason they're being done is for, in the event of potential conflict between the United States and China, they want to be able to damage, degrade, destroy our critical infrastructure. So if China decides they are going to invade Taiwan, or they want to take some sort of military action, that will likely be paired with China enacting blackouts in American cities, contaminating water treatment facilities in American cities, because if we are thrown into chaos domestically, why would we want to fight in the Indo-Pacific in a faraway conflict? They want to destroy our political will to fight by damaging things like our critical infrastructure here. Another vector of Chinese influence in the US is farmland agriculture. There was a recent story that went national out of Michigan last summer about students smuggling biological pathogens in the US that were assessed to be able to damage our agricultural supply. Again, this is just another one of those avenues by which they think that they can weaken our domestic resolve, our political will to combat them, and potentially throw our communities, our society into chaos. And there are a couple examples here. They own a few 100,000 acres of farmland in the US, which percentage-wise is an extremely low percentage, but it's not so much the quantity, but the quality. They're pursuing farmland near military installations. They're pursuing, they're inserting these potential pathogens that could damage our food supply. So again, just another vector of influence. And then cultural influence, this is a key one. Again, it's taking advantage of our open society. The Chinese Communist Party does not view our openness and magnanimity as a kindness to be reciprocated. They view it as a weakness to be exploited. And they are utilizing cultural institutions in order to pursue their objectives and get their message to be adopted and popular, especially amongst our younger generation. And a great example of this is Hollywood. The last time that Hollywood produced a movie that showed China in a bad light was in 1997. And when in 1997 that Hollywood studio did that, China banned that studio, that producer, and those actors from ever being involved in a movie that would show in China again, which is, cutting off massive economic potential to these movie producers. So coercive influence, right? Hollywood does not produce movies that would show China in a bad light because they want access to the market. So through so many different means, China has the ability to influence what we are doing here domestically. And anecdotally, I went to grad school with a couple of Chinese students who would go to protests in the DC area against the Chinese Communist Party, and they would put on masks. They wouldn't bring their phones because their families would get harassed back in China. because China is tracking their activities here in the U.S. So they are very much, involved looking at what we are doing domestically and trying to coerce our own population in the U.S. And then, of course, military ramifications. That picture on the left shows an American F-35, which is having great success in the Middle East at the moment, and it shows a J-35, which is the Chinese variant, which you'll be forgiven if they look like the same plane because they are extremely similar because they stole our designs and specifications. And in Michigan, in particular, there's no shortage of defense industrial base locations here that are of particular interest to Chinese espionage activities, and we should be under no illusions that these facilities in Michigan are targets of Chinese espionage. And these are a couple slides from my colleague who was not able to join, but of course, higher education is a significant vector of Chinese influence. Michigan University's 24 Pentagon grants, 84 million. These are sensitive grants with technology that has national security implications that the Chinese Communist Party is involved in. And if you are a Chinese Communist Party member working on a grant being paid for by US tax dollars, we should be under no illusion that that technology is not making its way back into China and in the hands of our foremost adversary. Lastly, again, just a few more examples, just showing the CSSAs, these cultural student associations. They are active, alive and well. These are funded by the Chinese Communist Party. Actions taking place in Michigan universities and universities across this country, directly involved in influence campaigns and at times outright espionage in the United States. And I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Rob. So I'll walk through mostly specific state solutions that have been enacted to counter some of the threats that are presented at the state level. But before doing that, I want to really reemphasize a point that Rob made on how this is a unique set of issues where Democrats and Republicans sound exactly the same, nearly exactly the same when they describe it. It was in 2022 that President Biden's Director of National Intelligence issued a memo. I know these things don't percolate especially well, but they issued a memo to state and local governments advising them that the Chinese Communist Party was trying to penetrate them and influence them in multiple ways. And it advised state and local governments to start sort of compiling data on what these entities were doing, sharing data between state and local government, having reporting on interactions between these entities and public officials. Furthermore, it was towards the end of President Biden's administration where the National Security Advisor sent a letter to every governor in 2024 saying that right now that they assess that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to hack water infrastructure across the country. So that went out to every governor. And they pointed to the Iranians as doing something similar. And then finally, towards the end of the administration, Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, presented information in the Wall Street Journal where he basically said, well, it was presented to the Wall Street Journal that he had held briefings with telecommunications companies about various hacking campaigns that China was doing within the United States. And in that presentation, had presented to them that China likely has the power to shut down ports, power grids, and other critical infrastructure across the country back then. And so there's Volt Typhoon, there's Salt Typhoon, there's Flax Typhoon. These are all just names for Chinese hacking campaigns to penetrate our critical infrastructure and then just kind of lie in wait until they might want to do something about it. So at State Armor, we think of solutions really in two buckets. One dealing with technology and supply chains at the state level, and another dealing with political warfare. So I have a lot of short versions of that. On the technology front, issues we've worked on at the state level: Pacific conflict stress test, critical infrastructure protection, procurement, property protection, and then pensions. And I'll walk through what those look like. On political warfare, we've worked on foreign agent legislation, transnational repression, the fourth example of which was just enacted in Utah last week, higher education protections, ethics reforms, and the ethics reforms really just come out of that memo that President Biden issued in 2022, kind of crafting that into what would a state law requiring those transparency look-throughs to be, and ending sister city partnerships with the adversaries, the fairly defined adversaries of the United States. And then last, I'll point out that a new area of protecting states, protecting the United States, is coming in the form of law enforcement by states' attorneys general who are bringing consumer fraud suits against a wide variety of Chinese technology providers because those providers are not disclosing to the purchaser that their data is being sent back to China. And in many cases, those providers, and I think more poignantly, are not disclosing to the purchasers that the Chinese government is able to remotely access and control and execute code upon those devices. One easy example, in January and then in February of last year, the FDA and then the CISA, the cybersecurity agency at the federal level, issued matching memos about the patient monitor next to a hospital bed, blood pressure, heart rate, everything like this. And it said this monitor, Contech, the memo just said Contech has a back door. And they assessed that all of the data from these machines in hospitals was being sent to one university, I think it was, in China. And that is hugely problematic. But they also assessed that the Chinese government could remotely execute code on those devices. They're really ubiquitous within and so what does that mean? If I'm on the device and my blood pressure is 120/80, they can make it say 180/120. And then you have a very different diagnosis. But scale that type of vulnerability across network connected technology that's on our critical infrastructure. And I think that that's a pretty scary possibility. So the Pacific Conflict Stress Test, the first state to do this was Nebraska. Then the state where I live, Texas did it. Arizona did a version of it. Kentucky is advancing a version of it right now, and Oklahoma did as well. And so what this policy asks is, if China goes for Taiwan, what happens here? And the model for this is the coronavirus pandemic. And we don't need to talk about how that happened. We just know it came from China, and it caused massive disruptions to supply chains. And so I think that is a model to consider, because if China, there's plenty of evidence that after that disease was moving around, that China began hoarding medical equipment. They were doing it within the United States. There are Chinese companies operating in the Midwest who publicly bragged about the fact that they hoovered up as much PPE as possible and sent it back to China because there was an information asymmetry. They knew that it was actually worse than they were telling us and things like this. And so the stress test looks at, okay, if they go for Taiwan, what our federal leaders have been telling us is they're going to cause disruptions here. And what that looks like in those states is they are assessing what happens to state supply chains, and that's specifically the state government itself, purchases that the state government itself makes. If you're looking at Michigan's whole economy, that's a really huge kind of job to look at. But if you look at what just the state government is purchasing, these states have found that to be a problem they could wrap their arms around. And then how might China target critical infrastructure? Of course, we have the experience of the supply chain problem from the coronavirus, accidental or otherwise, or they're just sort of keeping things for themselves. If there was a conflict in which we might be involved, we should assume that they might do this in a hostile manner. So how would they pull some of those switches that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan warned about? And you know, personally, I'm involved. The governor in Texas appointed me to this committee in Texas. I find it extremely valuable as someone who works on this stuff every day. We are finding things that I hadn't thought about, and finding ways for the state to solve those problems. You know, and thinking about the state level, what are your specific vulnerabilities? President Trump issued an executive order in March of 25 that said it is now national policy for state and local governments to take a leadership role in some of this resilience, in some of this protection of critical infrastructure. So the federal government is looking for states to step up on this area as well. Governor Abbott did his executive order, but then later Texas codified and expanded that executive order to create what is happening in Texas now. The second solution, I call it SIPA, Critical Infrastructure Protection Omnibus. If there are two problems that I think that Washington is under-assessing or maybe under-discussing, it is the penetration of critical infrastructure and the penetration of higher education. And maybe that's because those problems are kind of out there in a sense. The Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party has been doing incredible work, up to and including, I think yesterday they did some new stuff, on exposing the higher educational problems. And we have found that state governments are willing to work on that. I really think that the federal government's moving too slow on what is an extremely obvious problem set. Where should we go with China in higher education? There's a range of possible solutions, but there are some things that are happening that clearly just shouldn't be happening on our campuses. The Critical Infrastructure Omnibus, that began in Texas. There was a slide that Rob showed about a Chinese billionaire. He bought 140,000 acres. What those articles didn't highlight as much is that he is a general in the People's Liberation Army. And those 140,000 acres surround Laughlin Air Force Base, right on the border of Texas and Mexico. And he was building wind turbines. And I heard a really almost humorous discussion of this by a hedge fund manager in Texas who focuses on national security issues. He said, we rate areas for their ability to generate wind energy, and this was one of the lowest rated areas in Texas. Nonetheless, he was building all these wind turbines around Laughlin Air Force Base. The state enacted the Lone Star Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, which just said foreign adversaries cannot directly connect to the critical infrastructure or contract to provide critical infrastructure. And that has expanded. That's, I believe, an expanded version about to become law in Florida. Just last week, Utah enacted a broader version of this. And in Utah, they said not only can the foreign adversary not directly connect or provide critical infrastructure, we want their network-connected technologies to not be on critical infrastructure. And if you look at what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was saying, it is through a lot of those network-connected technologies, specifically a lot of routers. The dominant router in the United States is very connected to the Chinese Communist Party, and there have been multiple publications assessing that that is one of the main vectors through which they've gotten into our critical infrastructure. So one basic solution would say, don't use that router, critical infrastructure providers, but then there are other technologies that would fall in that bucket as well. Oh, so the Utah version of that is what we're highlighting here that just passed. On procurement, it's really the same idea. Their network-connected technologies shouldn't be on our critical infrastructure, nor should they be in state systems. And so it's very straightforward. Define, ICT, information communications technology, define it, and say we don't want state and local government purchasing that from a Chinese company, nor do we want it resold from a third-party vendor, just the same product. If you don't want that router from that company itself, nor do you want to purchase it through a third-party vendor. Number of states are working on this. Utah was one of the first. Tennessee's working on that right now. Florida's working on that right now. There are a number of states working on that. We just call it procurement protection. Anyone else, the United States, allied countries, just not an adversary. Of course, the feds define the adversaries as China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, but really you're not going to see many Russian companies. There's a few software providers that you want to be careful about, but in terms of providing hardware, that's mostly going to be Chinese companies. Genomic protection, we kind of talk about this within supply chains, and this, I think, a really good example for Michigan because one of your United States senators led on the federal version of this. And the federal version is called the Biosecure Act. It's broader than what is happening at the state level, but the Biosecure Act became federal law in the National Defense Authorization Act at the end of last year, at the end of 2022. Sponsors were Democrat and Republican on both sides. The state version of that is a little bit narrower, but what it says is genetic sequencing technologies that come from these companies that are sanctioned 2 or 3 different ways by our federal government. We don't want these used in any state-regulated healthcare facility. I will point to this quote. It's extremely spooky, but this was written by the man who ran their equivalent of the National Defense University. Speaks to how they think of this. In a publication he wrote in 2017, I believe, in the development of biotechnology today, the most lethal weapons are genetically engineered weapons designed to attack people based on their specific ethnic or racial background, causing specific races to become ill, such as suffering immune deficiency, loss of intelligence, sterilization, or even death, while leaving other races unscathed. This particular problem set is one where I've spoken with people who served on National Security Council on both Biden and Trump, and this is something where I've uniquely received outreach of these types of people saying, if 50 states could do that, that would be amazing. I don't know exactly what they're looking at, but they're looking at something very scary, which speaks to why the federal government did what they did and why states are working as well. There are also other provisions like just don't store genetic data in a foreign adversary country, common sense stuff like that. Pension divestment, simply not investing state and local pensions in China. We did a legal analysis of the issue. We actually think that you cannot fulfill your fiduciary duty of care with any investment in China because they ban by law reporting of accurate data. They define this all as national security data. They're not allowed to actually tell you, the truth about some of these companies. But furthermore, the lion's share of Chinese market cap listed in the United States comes in the form of what's called a variable interest entity. So actually, when you invest in a Chinese company, the big ones like Alibaba, what you actually own is a derivative contract with a company in the Cayman Islands that the Chinese government does not recognize as real ownership. So it's this kind of squeaky way to get money from us without actually giving us ownership. China's very good at doing this type of thing. So a number of states have been divesting their pensions. The federal government fully divested the roughly $1 trillion thrift savings plan from Chinese entities. There are 2 of Michigan's top 10 pension holdings are Chinese companies. One of them is a sanctioned military company. Foreign agent registration, Nebraska enacted a broad version. And I would point out that the sponsor of all significant legislation in Nebraska is a Democrat state senator who works with the Republican governor on all this stuff. They passed a foreign agent registration bill that provides robust transparency. It very much just models what the federal law looks like without the carve-outs that exist in the federal law. So there's a federal foreign agent bill. There are roughly 17, I didn't look today, 17, 18, or 19 within the entire United States. There are under 20 agents registered with a principal of the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese government, Chinese company. That's because the federal version is just shot through with so many loopholes that it doesn't really capture much. If you're a lobbyist, you don't have to register under that. If you're engaged in academic activity where there's massive espionage, you don't have to register if you're engaged in commercial activity. So that was written for a prior era before we had sort of a party state that integrates itself with all of its national activity. Texas passed a different version of this, much lighter on sort of reporting requirements, but then Texas just said a lobbyist in the state of Texas, defined in this section of law, is not allowed to accept payment from a foreign adversary source. So there's less reporting, but basically lobbyists are dropping those clients. A very important solution that is starting to move at the state level is transnational repression. The bipartisan Congressional Executive Commission on China authored that Wall Street Journal op-ed just, I think about a week ago, on how transnational repression is occurring within the United States. So one of the most sort of unbelievable examples from recent history is the American gold medalist now, Alicia Liu, whose family was hunted in China's what they call Operation Fox Hunt. So China wanted her to compete for China, just like they wanted the snowboarder or skier to compete for China. Her family refused. Her father was actually a very famous advocate for democracy in China. He was involved in the Tiananmen Square stuff, and then he had to flee the country. He's been in San Francisco since 89 or 90. And because of the refusal, they just started stalking this family across the country. They received FBI briefings. When she competed in 22 in Beijing, her father wasn't allowed to go because the United States said, we don't know if they might just keep you. And I believe that she was escorted by federal agents for that trip. There are many other such examples. So China had an operation that I just called Operation Fox Hunt. They believe, and they say this, that anyone with a drop of Chinese blood is bound to what they call, they actually say the Yellow Emperor, which is the leader of China, that the leader of China has control over everyone who has Chinese blood anywhere in the world, the diaspora community or not. And so they believe it's their responsibility to police those people because they could pose a threat. So transnational repression is when there are crimes committed in the United States on behalf of a foreign party. It's not just China that does this, but they're the most pernicious and the most obvious. 4 states enacted legislation on this now, most of it unanimous or nearly unanimous: Texas, Nebraska, Arizona, and now Utah. And the federal government is considering a legislation on this. Higher education, Rob showed some numbers. The House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party has been putting out tremendous information. This is one of the things to me that's just the most unbelievable. We have grants coming out of the Pentagon for military research, and then our universities are turning around and partnering with China's military. It's not even, sometimes it's just a Chinese university, but oftentimes, so there were 1,400 publications funded by the Pentagon, went to universities, University of Michigan, University of Texas, where I live. Over half of those publications, over 700 of those publications, the Chinese partner was associated with the Chinese military. I personally think that this is kind of a moment of national insanity, where we have our military funding research at our universities, where we are getting their military to partner with us on that research. There's a lot more they do on higher education. One thing I would point out is that multiple congressional committees wrote a letter to Secretary Rubio last week asking him to designate the Chinese Students and Scholars Associations as a foreign mission of the Chinese Communist Party, these CSSAs. CSSAs are ubiquitous on large campuses. They're on Michigan's large campuses. They're on campuses across the country. The State Department assessment, our State Department assessment that's been online for 5 or 6 years now, says that the purpose of the CSSAs is to monitor the diaspora. And I've spoken with Chinese students. They'll tell you, we know who the spies are. We know who's here to keep an eye on the rest of us and report on us. So the CSSAs are to monitor the diaspora, the other Chinese students. They engage in intellectual property theft, and they ensure that the party's view of the world is well represented on campus. The congressional letter from last week cited over 40 of these CSSAs report in some way to actual consulates of the Chinese Communist Party, and many of them actually require a loyalty oath. They have to take a loyalty oath. And so this is not a Chinese ethnicity group, it's a Chinese nationality group. And there are many examples where an ethnic Chinese wanted to join the group, they weren't allowed to join the group. On the last 2 solutions I'll talk about here, ethics, that's just the image you see there is that memo from the Director of National Intelligence saying you need to have more reporting about who public officials are interacting with, be careful about gifts that they might give you, trips that they might want to give you, sister city partnerships. And so what a number of states have done, Texas specifically, I think Florida's looking at some of this now, is having ethics requirements, one, to train public officials on this is how they do influence operations, and then 2, requiring reporting. So if someone's trying to give you a gift, having that reporting to a centralized place. That's one of the things that ODNI pointed out is all this subnational activity is what they call state and local. It's so scattershot, and states aren't even sort of centralizing what interactions are we seeing within our own state from from the Chinese Communist Party or another adversary. And so ethics legislation would provide training to state officials and local officials on what to watch out for, but then requirements, like when you're seeing these things, start reporting them so we can keep an eye on what they might be doing. In Texas, which is obviously a big state that deals with foreign countries a lot in some ways, they actually stood up a unit to deal with foreign influence operations. They stood up a unit under state law enforcement. There was a recent report from Jamestown Foundation just in the last month about what's called the United Front, and they assess that there are 1,000 entities within the United States that in some way work for or report back to the Chinese Communist Party. I know that somewhere between 70 and 80 of those are in Texas, and these are spread out all through the country. So the problem is quite spread out in Texas, and that's one of the reasons they started looking at it. But Texas also deals a lot with cartels, and so they're kind of used to looking at these types of things. And then sister cities, we've seen a couple states just saying, we're not going to do sister cities with foreign adversaries. That same memo from President Biden's Director of National Intelligence said sister cities with them are a very different thing. Any sister city partnership on their side reports back to an agency that reports directly to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. So they're looking to do influence operations through their sister cities. And then last, the new area where we're seeing state law enforcement is attorneys general bringing fraud claims. I mentioned Contact, that's the patient monitor. Lorex is a camera that is supposedly Canadian Taiwanese, but very likely is actually just banned Chinese product, federally banned Chinese product. Nebraska has sued Lorex, and then Nebraska has also sued Residio. Residio is a big company in Arizona that's selling a lot of Chinese cameras that they're not disclosing the features that these have. Texas has done, and this is kind of recent, a whole swath of consumer fraud suits. TP-Link that's the router provider there, the dominant router provider in the United States. There are a lot of federal warnings about what comes with a TP-Link router. Hisense is a television, TCL is a television, Lorex is camera, Anzu is a really relabeled Chinese drone. So the drones got banned and then they stood up a company to relabel them. Temu and Shein are these fast fashion apps, and then Cattle actually has some nexus with Michigan. It's a battery company. They are putting together a battery facility in Texas, which the Attorney General there assesses might violate the critical infrastructure protection law because those batteries arguably allow for remote access to do things on the grid. A few other pieces of technology I'd point out. Washington Post published December 10 of last year about the solar inverters that are in, I think they assessed 85% of utilities that use solar nationwide use this Chinese solar inverter that's just controlled by their military. So the assessment in the Washington Post is they could just cause rolling blackouts as they would wish to do so. And you'll find that with a lot of network-connected technology. There are publications out there about Unitree robots having backdoors that allow them to, I mean, it sounds kind of humorous, but actually like turn them into a drone army here. They would be able to remotely access and control Unitree robots. There's all sorts of technologies like that. And so the state angle, and what I'm talking about is the fraud angle, is it's just, if what I'm saying is found to be true in a court, this is just straightforward fraud. Like you're selling a product that has a party state control behind it, is leaking all your data, you're not telling the consumer that, that's straightforward fraud. And so that's why we're seeing more state actions. I think that there will be more state actions from both red and blue and purple states on this attorney general front as well. To me, it's like a new version of tobacco. Like you have these very harmful products being sold, and the buyer is not being told about the harm that these products can cause. And I think all 50 states should start bringing claims against the companies, the Chinese companies, but then there are also sometimes American companies involved in the lie of what these products do. It's a great way to raise money for the state because consumer fraud claims end with money going to the state in a settlement. So those are all state solutions that we've worked on. There are more that I didn't include in here, but I think this is a good place to start for now, and happy to discuss any further.
That was a lot. I think we could have broken that into a couple hearings. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Rob, for your presentation, and I know we have a number of questions. Before I get into the questions, though, I mean, you covered a very, very broad spectrum of risk and vulnerabilities and potential fixes in some of these areas as well. So I really, really appreciate that. I did have a couple questions regarding more on Rob's presentation, where we know of different intrusions. We'll say grailing, where there's a student's spying or sightseeing at grailing and such. But is there other documented cases where the CCP or attempts by representatives of the CCP here in the U.S. on our bases, whether either through physical surveillance or that technological surveillance occurring?
Yes, sir. There's been numerous instances, and I'll go even further in that there's been instances of U.S. service members being implicated as CCP, MSS, Ministry of State Security, which is like their version of the CIA and FBI combined agents. And when I was stationed in San Diego working in the Naval Special Warfare community, there was actually somebody in the logistics community that got arrested. She was an E5. Her husband was a PLA officer. She got arrested for taking sensitive equipment that our SEALs use and providing it to her operatives. So there are instances of students, taking pictures. As you said, there's instances of U.S. service members being compromised. But certainly, sir, yes, there's no shortage of instances.
I believe we just had that retired officer, that was teaching them how to fly F-35s, right?
Yes, sir.
And Chair, if I could add, I meant to say this because there's a Michigan nexus to one of these stories. The Daily Caller's Philip Lenzicki does investigative reports on some of this type of topic. We've worked with him on some of these. In November of last year, he dropped what I really consider to be a bombshell. There's a trailer park at Whiteman Air Force Base, and Whiteman holds all of our B-2s, all of our stealth bombers that are not forward deployed. There's a trailer park that shares a fence with the actual base, and his assessment was the owners were tied to Chinese intelligence. They're based in Vancouver, and a trailer park's a perfect asset for that. The Secretary of State in Missouri has looked into that and canceled the business license for that company. So hopefully there's a resolution coming or has occurred there. That's right off of Whiteman. The same investigative reporter, Philip Lenzicki, published in January of this year at Barksdale in Louisiana. There are golf courses, one on either end of the runway, and both of those golf courses are owned by a Chinese American who perhaps even today still works for Chinese intelligence. So he worked for United Front entities within the United States. He even published a book back in China describing all these operations he was doing within the United States. And so there are golf courses on either end at Barksdale that are owned by someone who has worked for an entity that we generally describe as Chinese intelligence. And so those two specific examples, and there are probably more, but the Whiteman, the couple that owned that facility at Whiteman, they also owned a property in Pontiac, Michigan, very close to the General Motors Global Propulsion Center, which does a lot of dual-use military technology development. And so they own kind of a smattering of properties, all in very unique places across the United States. And that is reported in Philip's articles. And I think that he's also found other things that maybe aren't in the article, but there was a very strong Michigan nexus to that couple in the Whiteman Air Force Base expose.
More than coincidence.
Perhaps more than coincidence.
Well, we did have the representative from DGI here a couple months ago, representing DGI, and we had discussed backdoors, and he was very adamant that there were no backdoors in their technology, that the technology is not stored and or remotely sent to China, to any data centers or anything in China. Although DJI could do an update to every single DJI around the world to remove the geofencing, so I'm not sure if that was necessarily true. If they can send out, they most certainly could probably receive back. I'm assuming.
Mr. Chair, I'd be very suspicious of what he told you. There are congressional requests. They have asked the cybersecurity agency to declassify information about DJI about security vulnerabilities that are not currently in the public domain. There are letters asking for that. So the letter is asking for something that seems to exist behind the curtain. But more notably and perhaps humorously, in the last 2 months, there was a report put out by kind of friendly hackers who had a DJI vacuum cleaner going around the home. And these guys were able to take over thousands of vacuum cleaners worldwide just through finding a backdoor in their own vacuum cleaner. And they were able to watch video of these vacuum cleaners, and they were tapping into servers in China to do this. So they might say a variety of things. I mean, I would say that it is Chinese law that they must lie to you. It is Chinese law, they must lie to you about any of this stuff. And they're probably more afraid of consequences over there than they are over here.
Wow, technology certainly has went past our ability, I think. I'm going to get to some questions. Minority Vice Chair Mensur.
Thank you, Chair. I'm kind of glad you mentioned DJI. So here's a little question for you. I know that the United States has banned us from buying DJI drones, but we know that there's a lot of them out there, right? Although they're banned, there's still the DJI headsets, the first-person view headsets, with the goggle view. You mentioned specifically routers, the Chinese cameras, you mentioned the inverters. So I guess my question is how easy have we made it for them to spy on us by buying all this material?
Thank you, ma'am, for the question. We have made it exceptionally easy for them to spy on us for numerous reasons, and I'll go back to like the strategic kind of view of this is what's been called strategic narcissism or the golden arches theory or integration in the global economy. That all of these things would modernize them. That our openness to China, to the CCP, would in some way encourage them to pursue becoming a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And we opened the doors for them, right? We gave them the keys to the kingdom. And of course, they never viewed our openness as an incentive to reform. They viewed it as strictly transactional. And they have taken advantage of our openness, our magnanimity, and in so many ways, Michael mentioned like cultural suicide or suicidal empathy or whatever it is. In so many ways, we've made it so easy for them to do so. And DJI is a great example. This has obvious military implications. People will say that, they don't store the data in China, but if you were China and you viewed the United States as your foremost adversary, what would you say and what would you do, right? You would come here and you would say, don't worry about it, while asking states and communities to buy this material, and you essentially have proliferated ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, around the country, and we let them in. So yeah, absolutely, it's a problem.
So that tells me we're pretty darn naive when we know already that they can, use drones or other ammunitions to take out our electrical grid, our water infrastructures, and completely devastate us. It seems to me it's almost pretty damn naive that we haven't actually done anything except for the few states that you've pointed out who actually passed some House bills or whatever. So that's pretty darn disturbing to me.
Madam Vice Chair, one story I would point to, it was in the Financial Times. This is not to take any position about current geopolitics, but there's a story called Inside the Plan to Kill Khamenei. So it was the Israeli plan. And it discusses how the Israelis had backdoors into the traffic cameras. There's an Israeli agent quoted as saying, "We knew Tehran better than we knew Jerusalem." And it's because the Israeli intelligence, which is, they're obviously quite good, was able to backdoor into a lot of these network-connected technologies, many of which are Chinese in Iran, I would note, but many here are also Chinese. We have their technologies all over the place. And then when we don't have their technologies or we ban their technologies, I mentioned some of those camera companies. There's really, I think, interesting testimony from last year from a gentleman from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and he says, the FCC banned Dahua and Hikvision cameras, but we audit critical infrastructure, and a year after that ban took effect, we found the incidence of that camera had gone up 40% year over year. And they find the cameras because they find which devices on this power station are beaconing data back to China. It went 40% year over year, and they assessed that was because the same camera was just being relabeled and sold within the United States. And we have found, we think, dozens of companies just on cameras that are relabeling banned cameras and selling them all across the United States. They probably still have the majority. Illegal Chinese cameras are probably still the majority of the market in the United States right now, or something close to that. And thankfully there are people bringing it. There's fraud in not telling you what the technology is doing, but then there's fraud in saying this is a nice American camera when it's very much something different. So hopefully there's more action on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Menser. Yeah, I was very, very enthralled with that stress test that you mentioned as well. I think that's a very particular skill set to be able to have to determine what could occur. And I think Representative Menser just bringing up that and talking about network devices, et cetera, what could happen if those things failed, or worst case, backdoors that made other things fail through it. Keeping an active critical infrastructure control mechanism. We don't necessarily have that here, but they seem to be setting a platform where they will have active critical infrastructure control, and that's pretty scary. Representative Shriver.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought the cultural influence portion was very interesting, especially the, China having the puppeteer over Hollywood. You mentioned the open society and how America is vulnerable to be influenced. What I'm wondering, as far as Hollywood being run by China, do you think that Hollywood has programmed movies with more sexualized content?
Well, I guess first I don't want to be on the record saying that China owns Hollywood, right? They are able to exert significant coercive influence, and Hollywood producers are not going down certain paths in order not to anger the CCP so they can get access to the market. On things that China is encouraging, whether that be over sexualization or violence, you could point to Hollywood. I would point towards TikTok. The algorithms driving polarization, driving viewpoints that are corrosive, and again, in their view, corrosive to the development of a successful young adult. So certainly they are pushing narratives on us that they ban in China domestically because they view it as dangerous, in order to push that polarization, division, and messages that lead towards irresponsible behavior.
Do you have any statistics comparing Chinese-controlled studios versus whoever ran the studios before to compare an increase or decrease in that type of programming targeted towards children?
Not on me, sir, no.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the NBA has had some influence from the China as well, I believe, as I recall. But I know we're getting near the end. Representative Conlon.
Well, this is fantastic. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Mr. Chair. So exactly a year ago, because I looked at my calendar, and I happened to have the same notebook with me today, but I had an hour-long meeting with State Senator Elliot Bostar, who's the Nebraska senator I think you were maybe referring to, along with our state senator, Sarah Anthony, and literally learned everything then that you're talking about now. I have my notes, and it's about everything you've mentioned: lobbyists, cybersecurity, land acquisitions, everything. So it's just a great bookmark. And at the time, I talked to Chair Brook about that, and we have done, and my name is on one of the bills around procurement, because that was a big issue. But I'm wondering, one of the last things that are in my notes from when I spoke to him, and I know they do now have, they're looking basically at companies have to let you know whether they're lobbyists or companies that if they're doing work with adversarial entities, and that is through the Attorney General, I believe, and then you can't get tax incentives and things like that if you're on that list. But how do we begin to look at our own vulnerabilities in the state to know, like, to take our own audit of where all of this is? Or is it impossible to know where the cameras are? Land owned by the Chinese. I mean, we know that they are grabbing up lots of land. A lot of foreign entities are, particularly around the Detroit area, we know. But, like, I just wonder how we start. And to that end, I was a journalist for 35 years, mostly with the New York Times. My husband was with Reuters, and we were overseas for 20 years, and we were about to be moved to Hong Kong. And then when Hong Kong took over China, Reuters moved everybody instead to Singapore. We did not end up in Asia. We ended up in the Middle East. But I'm very much against TikTok having been allowed to be here, when as journalists, you know that we're not allowed to do anything over on their side of, so it's crazy. But how do we even begin to know what our vulnerabilities are? Because they appear to be so many.
Representative, first I'd like to say, Senator Bostar, we were honored to name him Lawmaker of the Year in our first year of existence. So he represents Lincoln, Nebraska, and some of the areas nearby, and he drives about every solution you could drive at the state level, up to and including. When I said that there are some things that I didn't mention, it's because Senator Bostar is kind of writing a new script in Nebraska on some new things to do. But in terms of assessing the state's vulnerabilities, so I could tell you within the stress test context, there are groups like national laboratories and national academic institutions that are willing to help. For the Texas committee, we have no money. There's no appropriation. I mean, if we did it again, maybe there would be an appropriation and some resources. But there are people, there are groups raising their hand. The universities within Texas immediately tagged in to help. There is some really good research groups coming out of some universities in the Washington, D.C. area that are coming in to help, that will even help with like a tabletop exercise. Okay, China goes for Taiwan, here's what they might do to your state. So with no resources, what I found is when states put their hand up that they want to start solving these problems, people will find you. And if not, I mean, we'll help people find you. But in terms of actual problems to solve, you can enact policies on procurement without knowing the entire universe of what bad stuff you might be buying, but you're now just going to say, going forward, we're not going to buy that type of stuff. You can enact laws without doing that. One thing, and this hasn't happened yet, but because of the situation in Louisiana where there's a pretty clear risk, I am not the biggest fan of the concept of eminent domain generally. Like it's a somewhat fraught concept. But I think that it's reasonable for a state to consider expanding eminent domain for for like really bona fide national security threats, where you could, most of the time when a state does a law on land property, they say going forward, no more such and such of this anymore. But if you find a really serious vulnerability, I think you ought to have a way for the state to buy out that owner and have that threat not be right next to that really sensitive thing. And so that would be a tool to allow you to look backwards for when you find threats. There are also intelligence firms, and I don't work with any of them, but there are intelligence firms. I think a lot of them do a good job. And if a state had resources, they could engage one of these firms and say, well, I'll give you one example. There is one state that engaged sort of an intelligence firm, but it was a firm that could just look at Chinese companies that were coming into the state and actually look what they say in China in Chinese. And this state was giving out tax credits to these companies. And as soon as these assessments started coming in, they started saying no more tax credits to these companies. And then furthermore, we need to find out where the other ones are, specifically the ones that have clear ties to the People's Liberation Army. And they found that they were in really bad places. So that there are firms that will kind of take that on. They could look through your business records, find what Chinese firms are. Okay, these are just selling widgets, whatever. But then some other firms are going to have things behind them that are going to be a little bit scarier.
One thing he mentioned in my notes, and I don't know if this is because we're automotive or just generally because they do, but he mentioned batteries quite a bit. And I don't know if that was because, is there anything being an automotive state that makes us more vulnerable?
Representative, I would be very suspicious of their batteries. President Biden designated them a military company. That's Cattle, and I know that they're discussing partnerships. BYD is another one discussing partnerships in Michigan. And there was an early release from the Pentagon where it looks like the Pentagon is going to blacklist them as a military company as well. We'll see if it ends up that way. But the problem with the batteries is they have significant remote sensing capabilities if it's just the Chinese battery. And there's a story from Camp Lejeune from 2024 Marine Corps base where all of a sudden it was determined that the Cattle batteries needed to be ripped out very quickly. I think that there's never been a discussion of why that all of a sudden occurred, but there's a reason why that all of a sudden occurred, where it would be great if there's more public discussion. But the batteries are collection devices just like many other connected technologies. And when they're connected to critical infrastructure specifically, there's a real capacity to sabotage critical infrastructure through the batteries.
Yeah, 1 minute. I'm said 1 minute. Well, we truly appreciate both of you being here today. Thank you for what you do with State Armor. As you can see, our committee is, I'd like to say, the least partisan committee here in Lansing. We truly do want to see our state safer, and that's evidenced by what we discuss and how we get along here, and that's by design. So thank you so very, very much. I have a million questions. I'd love to learn more, and we're going to learn more, but we have to end. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then Representative Shriver moves to excuse absent members. Being no objection, motion prevails. And there being no further business before the committee will stand adjourned.